certified archivist. She lives in Kill Devil Hills with her retired Air Force husband, Rich, and their German Shepherd, Duke. We also have Miss Tamara Creef. She is a retired archivist from the Outer Banks History Center. She holds a bachelor's degree in art history and a master's of public administration. She has spent the last 15 years processing collections and guiding researchers to the treasures housed at the Outer Banks History Center. Following her retirement, Tamara started a new business called Roanoke Island Tours, where she provides local history research services and tours around the region. She resides on Roanoke Island with her husband, David, and her dog, Pretty Girl, and her Amazon parrot, Staunton. And you can tell that she is definitely enjoying retirement too. She has the biggest smile on her face. But I would like to welcome Tammy up to the stage, and we'll go from there. Thank you for coming today.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Tammy. That's Tama. So if you say Tam, we'll both answer, and then you got all bases covered. Okay, so we are the Outer Banks History Center. We're the Eastern branch of the State Archives of North Carolina, and we're administered by the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, just like the Museum of the Albemarle is. We are located in Roanoke Island Festival Park, just across the water from downtown Manio. So, you know, we have plenty of free parking. If you want to come and visit us and do some research, you can spend the day. Free parking, walk across the little bridge and have some nice lunch, kind of make a day of it. We have a wonderful reading room where you come and you access our materials. We have a stack room where we keep our all of our beautiful archives in a very safe, climate-controlled environment. We're 6 feet above the ground to avoid flooding. We have a halon fire suppression system, and we really control our relative humidity and temperature in our stacks. So we keep them about 61 degrees, so they're nice and cool. We always wear cardigans, and the records are happy. They're in this, you know, perfect environment. We are considered a closed stack archive, so when you come and do research, you don't really necessarily browse our boxes. You have to come in and tell us what you're looking for. So you can either browse our catalog. We do have an online catalog where you can kind of like a library. You can search by keyword to see what kind of collections we have, or if there's anything that meets your research interest. Or you can just walk in the door and ask us, hey, I'm researching this event, or I'm researching my family, or this town, or I need a map, you know, anything like that. And we can look in the catalog and help you that way to access our collections. Okay, so our mission is to collect, preserve, and provide public access to historical and documentary materials relating to coastal North Carolina, and to serve as an accessible, service-oriented center for historical research and inquiry. And I want to emphasize coastal North Carolina. So there's actually 3 branches of the state archives. You have the main branch that's in Raleigh, downtown Raleigh. That's the big mothership. And then you have 2 satellite branches. We are the coastal branch, so we collect kind of coastal maritime history. A good rule of thumb is that if it's a county that touches the ocean, we collect its history. We also have a sister branch out west, which is Western Regional Archives. They're located in Asheville, and they collect mountain history. So if you have Appalachian, you know, ancestors or anything with the western part of the state, Western Regional Archives is our sister branch. Okay, our services. So in addition to, you know, the typical reference services coming in and accessing our collections, we also do image reproduction. So if you find a photograph in our collections or a document, or even, you know, a large map, we can scan them and reproduce them for you. It doesn't violate copyright, especially if you're just going to hang it on your wall. If you want a nice piece of inexpensive artwork, we do charge a small fee for our imaging services just because it pays for the paper and things to print and the digitization time. But you'd be surprised how many beach cottages and restaurants all across the Outer Banks that have our pictures hanging on their wall. In addition to imagery production, we also offer oral history services. So if you or someone you know has an important story that you want to capture. We have, the State Archives actually employs a full-time oral historian. His name's John Horan, and he is based out of Raleigh, but he travels all over the state taking interviews. He could also do them virtually if he can't get to you, or if you just, you'd rather do it from a distance. And to put it in perspective, we have over 500 oral history interviews in our collections. So if you did do an interview with us or with John Horan, it does become property of the State Archives. So we keep it forever. We keep, we migrate it to new technologies and so forth, but we can give you a transcript. We can give you a reporting for yourself. This photo you see is actually George Henderson. That's John there with his back to you. They're doing an interview about the history of Manteo Airport because they just had their 80th anniversary. And he actually grew up there since World War II when it became an airport. Okay, so what do we collect? What do we have? These are our collection formats. Everything on the left you see is primary material, so it's original archival material. Manuscript collections include things like scrapbooks, diaries, it might be personal papers, it might be correspondence. We have organizational records, church records, things like that. Photographs, we have everything from the very earliest photographic process of daguerreotypes all the way through, prints, 35mm slides of the mid 20th century, all the way through digital media of early 2000s. So it pretty much runs the gamut of photographic media. We have original maps. In fact, our oldest item in the collection is a map. It's a Spanish map before the English colonists even got here. And ironically, it lists I think it's the Cape Fear River is called the Rio Grande on the map, which is kind of funny. But that's our oldest thing. We kind of break it out for tours and when we have VIPs in the back. We also have a big collection of architectural drawings and blueprints. We just received a huge collection that's our intern processed. That's all, blueprints and property boundaries and things like that. You're doing a property history, and it ranges anywhere from the Albemarle, Currituck, Pasquotank, all the way down to Hyde County. And it's a lot of building, like it's the blueprints for the original NC-12, so the beach road, original blueprints of the golf course, Whalehead Club, things like that. Ephemera, we have a lot. Ephemera, if you're not familiar with that word, basically means like a document or something that was created for one day, for one moment. It might be a high school graduation program. It might be, a wedding invitation, something that was created for a moment in time, but we have kept it for posterity. So, it might be the grand opening of Fort Raleigh or the grand opening of Wright Brothers Memorial. We have the original programs for things like that. And we still collect. I go around to the restaurants and say, give me one of your old menus because we like restaurant history and business history, and things like that. Works of art, we have a pretty significant collection of Frank Stick's artwork. Tama's probably going to touch on his art, his career as an artist and illustrator. Oral histories I mentioned, public records on microfilm. This is a lot of the state archives that have been digitized or on microfilm, and we have copies. And we do still have a microfilm reader. He's kind of old and he's big, but he still survives. So everything on the right you see are things that we have that are published materials. So this is things we don't own the copyright to, but we can still, grant you access. You can come in and research with them. We have over 20,000 monographs. So think of like rare books, local histories, local cookbooks, things like that. We're probably strongest in Northeast North Carolina, but we do have a lot of North Carolina histories, periodicals, newspapers. We collect the physical copies. A lot of the local newspapers don't archive their own newspaper. Coastland Times is a good example. So they actually rely on us to be the repository to keep the physical newspaper. So we have every issue that's ever been printed. We're actually working with Digital NC to get those digitized too. Vertical files are basically like subject files. So if we don't have an archival collection for you on a topic, we might have a vertical file which has some information about it. Okay, so what are we strongest in terms of subject matter? We have a lot on discovery and early exploration, anything from the Lost Colony all the way up to Jamestown. And most of that is books. So a lot of things on Native American history, a lot on early colonization, and that's really heavy in maps. We have a lot of old, you know, like several hundred years old maps that are helpful. Shipwrecks, lighthouses, the U.S. Life-Saving Service. These are some of our strong points. Two of our probably most used collections are U.S. Life-Saving Service. We have the original payroll records for the keepers and the surfmen, and then we also have the shipwreck reports. They're very heavily used. The beginnings of the state parks, Jockey's Ridge, the campaigns to save Jockey's Ridge, things like that. The beginnings of some of the national parks. We have a little bit, National Park Service Archives has a little bit. The Lost Colony Outdoor Drama. We have a lot about the play. Wright Brothers, it's mostly book content. I wish we had the Wright Brothers papers, but they're at Wright State University. They're not with us. Fishing, if you want a picture of a fish, I have at least 20,000 pictures of a fish. They could be hanging, they could be holding, they could be laying, they could be holding. Yeah, we have lots and lots and lots of fish. We're also blessed to have the entire body of work for several local photographers. And the great thing is these photographers, their lives kind of overlap. So with D. Victor Meekins, he's starting about 1900. Drew Wilson takes us all the way into the early 2000s. And so you have this full century of photographic coverage of this region that is, it's kind of priceless if you're looking for a photo of something. We also collect organizational and church records. So, and as you'll notice, a lot of these organizations are still active, like Elizabethan Gardens. Basically, a lot of these repositories being, in and around the Outer Banks, they don't have a climate controlled archive themselves. So they rely on us to be kind of their repository to store their records. With that, they are open to the public, so you can come and actually research them. And then what these organizations do is they come around about every 2 years, give us an accrual, and then the collection continues to build. But at least they know their records are safe, they're housed properly, they're cataloged, so even they can find what they need when they come, which is, probably better than if they were in their garage or whatnot. But you can kind of this is a good example of the type of things we collect. Genealogy and family history. So marriage indexes, cemetery records. Again, this is an area where we're strongest in Northeast North Carolina and the Outer Banks. I'm still trying to kind of build our collections of Southern coastal North Carolina. Personal papers. When Tama gives her presentation, she's actually going to touch on a lot of the David Stick papers, the Maud Stick papers, and the Frank Stick papers. So, this is kind of an example of some of the bigger family collections we have. And then we have scientific papers. And this is something that I think we're truly blessed to have, because these collections typically find their way into a university archive and not the state archives. So, but Stanley Riggs, Robert Dolan, they're two coastal geologists that did a lot of work, like decades of work on the Outer Banks. And they wanted their collections to be here where researchers could come, be in the environment and access their records. They're massive collections. And Stanley Riggs is still publishing. He's still doing work. He brings me a carload about twice a year. He just packs his Toyota RAV4 and he brings me new material. Francis Regalo collection is also a really valuable in terms of research value. He's kind of the father of modern hang gliding. One of our patrons is getting ready to write a biography about him. And so it's, if you've been to Jockey's Ridge, you'll know who Regalo is. David Stick is our benefactor and founder. Without him, the Outer Banks History Center would not exist. So in 1989, he compiled his entire house, which was kind of an archive in and of itself. I'm told he kept records in the bathroom, in the kitchen. His entire house was packed with photographs and maps and books that he had collected from the community to build this kind of, archive in a way. And then he ended up donating it all and creating the Outer Banks History Center. So Without him, we would not exist. And it is his father, Frank Stick, that Tama is going to talk about today, who helped bring the flat tops to Southern Shores.
Thank you, Tammy. The author and historian David Stick was an amazing man. He wrote close to a dozen books on coastal history of North Carolina. He amassed an amazing collection of materials that he donated to the state to start the Outer Banks History Center. But he did so much more than that. He was a community leader. He started the Outer Banks Community Foundation. He's shown here with his buddy Andy Griffith, Eddie Green, and George Crocker, the man who owned Galleon Esplanade. And they got together and convinced all the rest of their friends to donate money and start funds that still help to support young scholars today and nonprofits across the region. He was a Dare County commissioner, and he had his say about a lot of things. And let me tell you, David Stick had some opinions. He believed that North Carolina deserved better highways, and he got on the commission to make it happen. He started North Carolinians for Better libraries, and he picked up his father's torch to add the Wright Brothers Museum to the Wright Brothers Memorial, and to make sure that the Cape Hatteras seashore legislation crossed the finish line when it had been hesitated during the war. But probably one of the most important and lasting aspects of what David accomplished was to be part of the Coastal Area Management Act, fighting to prevent erosion and protect our shorelines. It's something that he was exceptionally proud of. But he was really proud of his father. He had some big shoes to fill. David was an amazing man. He couldn't hold a candle to his dad. Frank Leonard Stick was born in 1884 in what at the time was called the Dakota Territories. His dad was a storekeeper, moved the family to Nebraska, and Frank had, to me, the most wonderful life because he would go off into the woods for weeks at a time, hunting, camping, trapping, and fishing. In fact, there were sometimes the family didn't know where he was for better than a month, and he didn't care. He had a wonderful time of it, and it inspired him for the rest of his life. Turned out that he had a little bit of an artistic bent. He had a good ability to capture wildlife, and he pursued it by attending the Chicago School of Art for a short period of time. But what really changed his life is when he was invited to be part of Howard Pyle's Brandywine School of Art. Now, Howard Pyle may or may not be a name that you're familiar with. When he set out as a painter, American art was very staid. I was going to put in a still life, but that was a little too on the nose. You had portraits of people sitting still, looking forward. You had these beautiful American landscapes. They were still, there was nothing going on, and Howard Pyle couldn't stand it. So he started his own school of art and created a style of painting that turned the art world on its head. He did heroic visions of American exceptionalism. His colors were vibrant. His paintings weren't chiaroscuro faint. They were hard-hitting events that were happening in the moment. And Brandywine School, think in terms of, I don't know, Saturday Evening Post, Norman Rockwell, Harold Schoonover, and others. It's a school of art that changed things immensely. Well, while Frank was here, he met the love of his life, Maud Hayes Stick. She was a model for all of these artists at the Brandywine School. In fact, she's most known for one that you may know as the Madonna of the Prairie. It's in everybody's fourth grade school history yearbook. The woman on the covered wagon, that's Maud. And she was incredible. If anyone was going to be Frank's equal in his life, it was her. She hunted, she fished, she loved to camp. In fact, in our papers, we've even got a picture of her holding up a dead snake that she probably took care of on her own. She was an amazing woman. They had two children, David and his sister Charlotte. And together, the four of them traveled America before settling down. And Frank had a great career. They were in New Jersey, and he did a lot of work with publishers in New York. And the works that he did, again, following the style of Howard Pyle, this intense color palette, these beautiful American landscapes, these square-jawed American men and heroic women gazing off into the future. But what made these paintings unique is you're not looking at some guy looking at an elk. You're looking at a hunter who has just spied the elk, who has just seen him as he gets ready to drop the leaf in his hand and reach for his gun. Does the elk escape? Does he get it? That's the power of Frank Sick. And he had a good life. He was doing great. We're talking the early 1900s up into about the 1920s. He did a lot of advertisement for ammunition companies, for gun companies, Remington, all sorts of different hunting outfits, and became very, very popular. In fact, he also did hundreds and hundreds of calendars. Imagine this at every general store across the country above the feed barrels. But where he really came into his own was with the magazines, Field and Stream and Outdoor America. He wrote numerous articles to go with them and had at least a dozen covers on each. It was quite an amazing accomplishment. Along with all of it, he was painting. He was doing all sorts of paintings on his own. And I like this one a bit because it's he and Maud, and you can always tell it's him as the subject matter, because if the man is wearing a kerchief, that's Frank. That was just that and a stupid fishing hat. That was his mark. But the name of this is Catch of the Season, and that little bit of humor of, well, which is the catch, the fish or the girl? His paintings were very interesting and they evolve over time. And as I first started to look at them, I thought he was a nut. There are these very nice hunting scenes originally. There's a hunter getting ready to shoot a bear, getting ready to shoot a deer, getting ready to shoot a cougar. And then later on, there's a hunter getting ready to be attacked by a bear, attacked by a deer, attacked by a cougar. What is going on with this? And eventually, there was one that got so extreme that it didn't make any sense at all. You've got a man getting ready to shoot a bear in a canoe as the canoe is going over the waterfall with the two babies on the shoreline looking on. It's called a critical moment. Again, the moment in time. It didn't make any sense to me at all. Why on earth would anybody paint a picture like that? He was illustrating a story. He was illustrating all of these magazine stories. He was illustrating stories for Zane Grey and these wonderful Western writers. And so when we look at these paintings by themselves, they're a little odd. But then when you go back and you read the story that talks about the critical moment, it's the perfect illustration. Frank had a great career going on. He was very well known. He mingled with some of the very, very wealthy millionaire industrialists of the time. But in the 1920s, he put down his brushes, said he was sick of it. According to his son, when I talked to David, when I first started working at the History Center, he said that his dad got sick of people telling him what color to paint the sky, and he quit. Packed up everything, moved his family from New Jersey down to Wanchese, North Carolina. Now, you want to talk about some culture shock. Why on earth would this man who had lived in the metropolis around New York City move so far away to this random place? Well, Skyco Lodge is a beautiful place. It was attached with a hunting lodge. Hunting lodges down the Outer Banks were very, very popular because we had geese and ducks that migrate through. And there had been a great tradition for years for men to build these lodges to give themselves a little bit of a getaway. Drink, gamble, because, well, the women and the children were absolutely not invited. But the man who owned the hunting lodge in Wanchese had a wife who insisted that she build him a lodge. He built her a lodge so that she could come along with her friends and children when the men went hunting. The hunting lodge wasn't in use anymore, but they rented Skyco Lodge to Frank and his family for about 4 years. David said it was the happiest time of his life. And it probably was for Frank too, because during all of this time, He was meeting people who were local guides and hunters, and he was sharing that information with his very, very rich friends up north and bringing them down for hunting expeditions. In fact, he convinced two brothers, John and Henry Phipps, who were from a steel magnate family, to come down and build a couple of hunting lodges down in Hatteras, which he designed and built for them. He had big plans. Millions had been made in beachfront property. He hadn't sold a thing, but he had big, big plans. He started several different holding companies, one down in Hatteras, one up in Nag's Head. They changed over the years depending on what the project was and who was involved with it. So as you start doing research in his papers, it's dizzying as you try to keep track of, is this Kitty Hawk Land Company, is this Hatteras Holding Company, or who's doing what in any project. But his first project was really, frankly, one of my favorites, and I really wish that it had succeeded. Virginia Dare Shores was right around the area of Nag's Head, and in 1926, they were looking for their first investment. The area that you can see, sort of like the yellow blocks in the very crowded area, is where the original Virginia Dare Shores was laid out. And it was supposed to run from the Sound to the sea. And as you can see, it was pretty crowded, but they had the streets laid out and everything designed, including a wonderful pavilion. The advertisements promoted the idyllic shoreline and the opportunity to get away and own your own piece of heaven. Every little idea of what could draw a person in was used. They pulled out all the stops: fishing, hunting, wonderful weather. They swore there was never a hurricane, that there was hardly ever a cloudy day. He was able to get the support of W.O. Saunders with the Independent and the Daily Advance, forgive me, but the Independent let him write this long front page article, and using the newspapers became his first step in any projects that he undertook for the future, and it worked. He built the Virginia Shores Pavilion on the shores of the Sound. And in the interview with David, he talks about the fact that his father built 3 concrete block buildings: the house they lived in, the offices, and the kitchen for the pavilion, which was a wooden pavilion that reached out over the water, and a place where they could bring in excursion boats from Norfolk, Elizabeth City, to come take a tour of the property and hopefully buy a little bit of land. They've talked about the building of these buildings, that his dad used a cinder block making machine. And it took me off on a little bit of a detour because I'd never heard of this before, because I'd looked into how he made these houses. And what I found online was this image of the Sears and Roebuck do-it-yourself home cinder block cement making machine. And the way it would work is you had several different molds that would give you either a flat face or a rough face. And evidently Frank was partial to a rounded front. You would pour about 42 pounds of concrete into the block on top of a plate. You would close it down. You would twist it into place and then lift. Go ahead, just lift up that 42-pound block and set it to the side before you put in a new plate and start again. I don't know how they did it, but they did. They lived there for a few years. It was very successful. Not a lot of the land sold in the development, but Virginia Shores Pavilion became one of the most popular places for people on the Outer Banks and in the area to come down on a Saturday night to hear the bands play, or to have a fishing tournament, or to watch the boat races. It was a wonderful, wonderful time. And he had found what he wanted to do. Fortunately, came the Depression. That, coupled with a hurricane that took out the pavilion, and Frank was ruined. He lost almost all of his properties, lost them to the tax man, had to stand and watch them being sold on the courthouse steps. Didn't stop him. He knew that even though he wasn't going to be able to get the money to continue in his real estate career, there had to be something that he could do. And lucky for him, Franklin Roosevelt stepped in with the New Deal. Now, I assume that most of y'all are familiar with the New Deal projects, the Civilian Conservation Corps that did a lot of building projects, and the Works Progress Administration that focused largely on the art side of things. Well, Frank had by this time made a number of government contacts. He knew the governor. He knew several congressmen. He knew the local politicians. And he had an opportunity to create part of his first vision for the Outer Banks, because he knew that no matter how beautiful the ocean was, you really weren't going to get people coming here just for the ocean, just for the hunting. You had to have some sort of a draw. And boy, the Outer Banks had it. First project he undertook was the city of Raleigh. Today we call it Fort Raleigh. And he started off as usual with a long, heroic, I won't say gut raising, that's not the right word, but a heroic vision of what should happen at the most important historic site in America. He talked about the fact that Plymouth Rock was celebrated, but that the lost colonists, the start of English America, was not even observed. In fact, at this point, there wasn't much to it. This is what's called Lane's Fort, and this is the way it looked around the probably early 1950s. And there wasn't a whole lot going on there. His vision was to build a series of buildings, and he got the government money behind it to help him. The local people started out by building these. And so he had a log palisade and a guardhouse. The watercolors are his preliminary drawings, and you can see the finished pieces there. And he designed and oversaw the building of each of these. And then there were colonist cabins. There was John White's cabin. One was a museum. One was the gift shop. One was the visitor center. And they were all scattered around the city of Raleigh. But the one building that most people remember most fondly was the chapel. Now, this chapel was at the edge of the property, and it was the place where they would have Sunday services. And a lot of people reminisce about getting married in the chapel late in the day so they could catch the last ferry that would bring them to Elizabeth City, where they could get the train to Washington to start their honeymoons. And it was really wonderful, except for the fact that it was a Gothic style church with a thatch roof that looked like a log cabin. And it had nothing to do with reality. There was no way on earth that the lost colonists built anything that looked like this. And so in 1966, after the National Park Service had taken over the property, they had a project, Mission 66, where they went through all of their properties and got rid of anything that wasn't historically accurate. And these buildings were all either torn down or moved to another site. I bet you the Park Service wishes they had them today, but they were gone. But that didn't stop Frank, because he had kept going on with the legislation to get Fort Raleigh established as a National Historic Site. And with that success in his pocket, he moved on to the next one. And that's going to be the Wright Memorial. Now, I mean, almost immediately after he finished up with getting one project done, he started on the next, because he owned property near where the Wright brothers had done their experiments, their early glider flights in powered flight. And so as he approached the government to have this area also turned into a National Historic Site, they met into a little bit of a headwind. They were told that, yeah, well, that's nice. You've got this little area over here where the flight took place, but that's not really very important if you don't include all of this area over here where they did all of their tests and their glider tests. So by this point, Frank had gotten people to donate land, had gotten people to sell their land cheaply enough to help make this happen, but the government wasn't satisfied. And that's when he and Maud stepped in, and they donated the land that they owned to complete the requirements from the federal government to be able to create the Wright Memorial. And so in time, they got the Wright Brothers National Memorial, and in each step of it, the land was donated to the state. They created a state park, and only then the state park was given to the federal government. I have been tired by then. I said, yeah, I have done enough. But, oh, not Frank. He was just getting started. At this point, we're still in the depths of the Depression. And so he begins to work with the Civilian Conservation Corps to do some of the very, very necessary work that's needed here on the Outer Banks. He takes the responsibility of overseeing numerous transients of people who have come in from across the country to do work. And in fact, again, when there was opposition to having a transient camp in my backyard, he and Maud donated their own property to have a camp. They accomplished a lot, and you can see here, this is just a little bit of a list of the things that the CCC accomplished. They dug a lot of ditches. Mosquito control for malaria was incredibly important. They restored old Fort Raleigh. They painted schools. They weeded out old widow women's gardens. I mean, they did a little bit of everything, and Frank oversaw them all. But the project that he was the most proud of was overseeing the planting of wiregrass on the newly built dunes that were supposed to stop erosion along the Outer Banks. And if you come to the History Center, we've got a lot of oral histories where people talk about being part of that project. In fact, there was one fellow who was too young to do the planting, so they put him on a horse to ride around to chase the cows away so they wouldn't eat the sprouts. As this went on, Frank realized there was one more major project that he had to take on, and that was going to be the creation of the Cape Hatteras National Seashore. You see, he'd already seen what had happened up at the Jersey Shore. He had seen the Florida real estate snapped up along the beach so that there wasn't hardly any public access there anymore. And he knew that once businesses started coming to the Outer Banks, that if something wasn't preserved, that nothing would be preserved. And so to that end, he created a prospectus for an idea of a national park that would run all along the edge of the Outer Banks, those barrier islands. His dream being that it would start at Virginia and run all the way down toward Ocracoke. Well, his problem was there were already a lot of people in towns from Virginia, just about all the way down to Nag's Head. And it didn't start getting sparse until you got further south. And so that's where they put their energies. And he spent his time with that. He convinced the Phipps brothers to donate their hunting land as the first step for the first gesture towards this great national park. And frankly, I assume that his conversation to them was, look, you're not using it. You're not hunting. Think about the taxes you'll save. Just go ahead and just do this. And then he did it. I would have loved to have heard his sales pitch. And once they did that, other people were gradually convinced to either donate or sell. And in the final phases, by eminent domain, the final holdouts created what is today Cape Hatteras National Seashore. Now, I can tell you there are still plenty of people on the Outer Banks that spit when they hear Frank Stick's name, because they believe that their daddy could have sold their land for $1 million if only they hadn't donated it to the nation. You and I will have to sit down over a beer with that one someday. When Frank's work was done and the war was over and all of the government money dried up, he was back in the same situation that he was again. He had a family to take care of. And at this point, I learned something when I did this project for you guys, is that he spent some time in Elizabeth City. In David's interview, he talks about the fact that there were 3 years in the fall and the winter and the spring that Dad would move them to Elizabeth City. That 1 year they lived on Sheep Street, and by the end they lived downtown because Frank had a number of real estate offices that just kept replacing themselves. His son-in-law was an attorney, John McMullen. And so the two of them did a lot of business together. But more than that, in the 1940s, Elizabeth City eclipsed poor little Outer Banks. Y'all had better transportation, you had money, you had banks, you had communication. And so Frank spent a lot of time driving up that little 2-lane road back and forth. One of the projects that he did, from what I understand, was some FHA housing out near the airport. And I thought I was really hoping I was going to be able to show y'all pictures of it. You'll have to indulge me because I don't know what I'm talking about. Here's what I've learned so far, and I'm going to leave this to whichever one of you choose to take this on as your next research project. I took a look at the Sanborn maps, which were maps that will show you businesses in a different city. I tried to look at aerial pictures and other documents about Elizabeth City during World War II, and what I did not find was anything more than these few letters in Frank's papers about this project. First one writing to the people in the FHA saying that he has experience building low-income housing because of projects he did in Virginia Beach. A return that there had been a question about a slaughterhouse that would have to be resolved, and that whoever owned the property should get his property lined out as quickly as possible. And then there's the usual Frank Stick evaluation of the whole entire thing, that, oh, I could sell the entire thing out just like that. The first 50 houses will go to people in Elizabeth City. They're just going to snatch them up. I don't know. As close as what I think I found is maybe they're talking about what was called the Enfield Apartments. And if so, almost all of them have been torn down now. So if anyone ever finds out about Frank's FHA housing in Elizabeth City in 1940, please let me know so that we can add a couple of slides here. But it was an interesting sideline because he kept staying in real estate, that no matter what happened, he was determined to be a success. And I'd say that he finally found his success when he founded Southern Shores. Now we're talking 1950-ish. And this is a project that he goes into. He has an opportunity to buy about 2,600 acres of land in an area that's at the upper end of the developed area of the Outer Banks at the point. He makes an offer, says, hey, you want to sell your property? And the guy says, no. He says, hey, I will pay you $30,000 cash money right now if you will sell me this property. And the guy says, okay. Then Frank comes back again and says, yeah, I'll pay you $30,000. I'll pay you $10,000 now, a few thousand later. And the guy says, no. Frank takes him to court for breach of contract and wins because the judge decides that, yes, the man had agreed to sell the property and all Frank was doing was negotiating. So he owns Southern Shores. And there's a letter between Frank and David where they're talking about, where David's reminiscing about the name Southern Shores wasn't very exciting. It wasn't a whole lot to it. And frankly, again, they were on the northern part of the beaches. It didn't make any sense. And that beyond that, Dad had already done Virginia Dare Shores, Croatan Shores, Shores. Couldn't you come up with anything better? Evidently not. They were selling the dream from the sound to the sea. And it was a beautiful, beautiful piece of property. Dogwoods everywhere. And it's just lovely. There was beachfront property, there were rolling hills, pine trees, ponds, lots of wildlife, and it was away from everything. Well, when Frank started thinking about what kind of buildings he was going to build there, he decided that he was going to turn the typical idea of beachfront buildings on its head. This is the Buchanan cottage that you can still see on the beach. And it's the classic cedar shake, big wraparound porches, but Frank had something else in mind. He'd been inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonian design, and this house had two parts to it. First of all, it was made out of relatively inexpensive products so that anyone could have a home. But then from his design vernacular, from his point of view, it had to fit into the landscape. So these were low buildings made of natural materials that blended in with nature whenever possible. And Frank's response was the flat top. And following still that long, low design, it fits into, you just see it almost being part of the waves washing over the sounds. After World War II, there wasn't a lot of wood available around here. Most of it had gone off for the war effort and was still being regrown. And so he looked once again to those concrete blocks. Now, I'm not going to tell you that Frank was the one that came up with these ideas, because in the 50s, it was a very common way of building. It was quick, it was cheap, and people could do it relatively easily. And so the styles were very Spartan, kind of very direct, not a lot of extra detail to them. I'm very fond of this ad, an all concrete blast resistant house, this being the nuclear age and all. But these were starting to pop up all over the country. And Frank had certainly seen them. He'd been down to Florida, he'd been up to Virginia Beach, and these types of things were popping up all over the place, but ugly. But his had panache. Now, this is action. I'm stepping away from the podium. That's Frank Stick. He is walking across the street to his house in front of his studio. Next to it is his best friend McMullen's house. When he first started building Southern Shores, he couldn't sell a lot. And so he realized that the only way to sell this property was to sell it developed. And so he built first his house, and then he convinced his best friend to build right next to him. And then after that, things took off. And so these are a few of the different houses that you would have seen in the early 1950s, late 40s, popping up around Southern Shores. Sometimes they were one story, sometimes they were two stories. Quite often the roof lines would be of different heights, although Frank learned a hard lesson that by doing that, you put a lot of joints into your roof, a lot of places for water to sit and leak through the tar and the gravel. And so as his designs progressed, began to put a little bit of an arch into them. And so you see the design change just a little bit as it went on. And the whole thing about these houses is that the design was to be a vacation home. They were bright colors, they were turquoise blue, they were sea green, they were orange, they were coral. The people who owned them tended to keep them in the family for years. A lot of the deeds of the remaining ones that you look at, they get passed down from mom and dad to the kids because there's so many wonderful memories of coming down to the beach. And quite often, they've named them Pink Perfection, oh, so sandy. They were just beloved, wonderful places. This is an early picture of some of the flat tops on the beach, the Southern Shores development. And oh, wouldn't it have been wonderful if it could have stayed like that? But you can see sort of the early roads being laid out. They had a lot of trouble getting permission to get the roads connecting to the highway, so they just built their own. But one of the things that I'm very proud of Frank for doing is that I found a letter where he got in touch with the wildlife folks of North Carolina and said, I don't want to just run over all the animals that live here. What can I do to add ponds to keep the wildlife in the area? And so throughout the development, as they built houses, they always added in some extra waterways, some different things that would increase wildlife opportunity to live there. Now, on the other side of the coin, this was a restricted community when it was first built. What I have found in the papers is I have never read anything that Frank said that he condoned it. It was the 1950s. Evidently, that was the policy. What I did find in his paper was a quote that went something along the lines of that he found the poor excuse of tradition nothing but a way to try to keep racism going. And so I have a feeling that there were probably more than a few arguments in the building, but today it is like everywhere else on the Outer Banks, an open community to anyone who wants to come and enjoy an ocean breeze. The houses themselves had some unfortunate challenges. While they were wonderful, they were cold and clammy in the wintertime, and they were kind of hot and clammy in the summertime. They were concrete blocks, and even though they were painted and bonded and everything, still you had problems with the kitchen and the cabinets getting kind of moldy over time. You also had problems when you wanted to update the bathroom. If you had any plumbing problems, the plumbing was underneath the cement block and you couldn't access it easily. And so that was another problem that they faced. Oh no, what have I done? Go back. I'm so sorry. You're not gonna do it for me. I apologize, folks. This will take just a second. Resume slideshow. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. Oh, well, that's encouraging. I'm so sorry. Isn't showing. Let's see what it's going to do when we go to the next one. Okay, well, then I'm just not going to look at the computer anymore. The other problem that the buildings ran into was that they were at the ocean. And so that salt air rusted out everything that was exposed. The sand blasted every bit of paint. And so these idyllic vacation homes suddenly became a lot of work. In addition to that, some of them were damaged by the Ash Wednesday storm and following hurricanes. There's an oral history where a fellow from Lynchburg talks about all his idyllic memories of coming down here and spending his summers at the Outer Banks and Flat Tops, because they couldn't remember which ones because he was a teenager and they were running around and such, but he did remember that there was one that was destroyed during the Ash Wednesday storm and it filled up with sand. And I have a feeling that might have been the one. The other thing that happened is that tastes changed. People went from being able to afford their own private summer vacation home to what most of us have to deal with these days, which is being able to rent a house for a week. And with that, more and more people wanted more and more amenities, bigger and bigger houses. And to be able to afford it, they had to bring more and more people into it to be able to afford the houses. And little by little, the houses that Frank had built began to be eclipsed, began to be torn down and replaced. So much so that today, when you look out, you really have to search for the few remainders. Now, lucky for us, there was someone who got involved in realizing what was going on, that from going from over 100 houses, we were down to less than 30. And a young man by the name of Chris Nason stepped up. He owns Beacon Architecture, and that's him at the end down here holding the tape. And he had been hired to build a house to replace one of Frank Stick's houses, flat tops that had been torn down, and it bothered him. It bothered him that this unique style of housing was going away and nobody seemed to notice or even to care. And he took it on himself to begin a project to document the remainders. And he approached the Friends of the Outer Banks History Center, who agreed to help fund the project. He volunteered all of his time, but the Friends helped to pay for the interns who went out with Chris to measure the houses, to take detailed photographs, and then to go back and do architectural drawings of each of them. Now, this is one that I'll tell you is one of my very favorites. Used to be the Community Foundation building. It's recently been taken over by Southern Shores. It's 13 Skyline Road. It's not one of the beach cottages, but it's one that I've had some personal contact with over the years because I've always worked in nonprofits. So I was constantly going off there, dropping off grants, checking in on things. And it was just the most wonderful place. One of the first things you notice about the house is it has these large overhanging eaves. And what that does is it creates just a little bit of shade as you're coming in the house and you're squinting from being out in the sunshine and suddenly you're in the shade. And once you go inside, it's just so cozy and homey. It's low ceilings. Although wood for building was limited, he would always finish the buildings in either cedar or juniper, depending on what was available. So they smelled wonderful. It was shady. It was at least 10 degrees cooler as soon as you walked in. And then the wonderful thing about it is there was the general area, there were the kitchen, things all grouped together, but usually there was one more room off to the side for a little bit of extra privacy. Those eaves would give you the shade. And this is one that's a little bit unusual in that usually these houses had a screened-in porch. This one is closed in. But as you walk in, one of the first things you notice is this hand-hammered hardware. You see it throughout the houses, and it just gives you, even though it's later, it gives these a real craftsman sort of feeling. Now, the Nixon Cottage is another one that's still, and you can see it's beautiful. Oceanfront cottage, and it really does give you even more of that 1950s sort of flair of the flat top. And I love that car that he has in the drawing. Again, it's showing you the idea of the hurricane shutters, those wooden shutters that could be dropped in a hurry when the wind shifts and the storms come in. And it gives you an idea of just the layout of the house, how one piece sort of melds into the next. The house itself is very welcoming. Here you can see the kitchen with the laminated countertop. the cozy bedrooms where you just feel like you're being enveloped with woods, and an outdoor shower. Almost all these houses, one of the things that was included was an outdoor shower. And Frank was really very accommodating. There are a lot of letters where he writes to people. It's like, you decide, you want the bedroom on this side or that side? I don't care. I'll be happy to put the garage in for you. You don't want a garage? We will do a breezeway. The only thing that he insisted on was the orientation of the house, and that he dissuaded one woman who said that she wanted to be different and wanted her house facing north to south. And he convinced her it had to be east to west because the nor'easters that come through in the wintertime would make them just miserable, and that they would miss those wonderful summer breezes. And she acquiesced. This one's the Ocean Boulevard. And this one is a little bit more of a compact drawing here. And that beautiful screen porch. Can't you just imagine sitting there with a glass of wine, watching the seagulls fly by, feeling that breeze coming in? I mean, if that's not summer, I don't know what is. Those beautiful colors. And these houses are celebrated every year by the Southern Shores Southern Flat Top Cottage Tour. And I understand we may have a representative here today. You want to come up here and tell folks about the tour? Would you mind? If you would.
I want to take away from your excellent presentation. Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Davis. And it really isn't me I speak for, it's my wife, Sal. We organized the first tour in 2013. We've had 6 now. And we invite you all. And your presentation has been excellent. And I thank you so much for furthering the beauty of these places. We've owned ours since 2009. The tour is on the 27th. We already sold 300 tickets online. It's just 45 minutes away. You'll get to see the inside of 15 of these beauties. And ours has juniper paneling that when you walk in, you can smell it. And I wouldn't change it for the world. And yes, it's damp in the winter, and yes, it's hot in summer, but it's worth it. It's worth it. The plumbing is underneath. But the charm of the 50s that comes to you when you see there's only 25 rooms remaining. The last thing I'll say is in 1983, the majority of houses were still. Most of them were gone. Thank you so much. I'll be glad to answer questions after the presentation. And please come see them. They're really worth preserving. Thank you again for an excellent presentation about.
Oh, thank
Much
you.
appreciated. My
Thank
wife and I, my wife would be very appreciative.
I've had occasion to work with her. She's such fun. And I have taken the tour, and it's really a great day. So Frank and David worked together, but it's like any opportunity, any operation, there's going to be disagreements. And over time, there got to be more than a few. Frank started to step away from the business, and David was tasked more and more with taking care of the sales and all of the details of the day. And frankly, he didn't want it. He was doing it for his dad. He wanted to be an author. And in due time, it was agreed that David would step out of the business completely, and that Frank would be the one to do the signatories, and that they would decide to be father and son instead of business partners. Frank wasn't done yet, though. Oh, he wasn't even close to done yet. Again, I'm retired. If I stop today, I'm done. Frank wasn't done yet. He moved down to Florida, spent a lot of time down in the Florida Keys, and that's when he picked up painting again. And he became back once more who he really truly was, an artist. And his works in Florida aren't really detailed. There's not a whole lot to him. He picks up oils, he experiments with acrylics, but I think at this point he's just doing it for the fun of it. But he also spent a great deal of time in the Virgin Islands. And at that point, you can see that something has taken his heart, because he starts using these watercolors, and there are people in here, and these are soft, loving scenes. And this is a place that he came to love a great deal and to become quite concerned about, because he was watching development start there, the same as he had seen in so many other places. And so once again, he did his magic. First, he found himself a millionaire friend, and he said, Lawrence Rockefeller, I want to talk to you about the Virgin Islands. He wrote articles, he contacted government people. Rockefeller donated the first piece of land, and today there's a Virgin Islands National Park. Again, I'm sure that there is disagreement from people who were descendants from that land and whether or not. But you look at one side of the Virgin Islands and it's nothing but private property and hotels and development. And then you have the national park. He wasn't done. He still wasn't done. He went back to painting some more. And at this point, he decided that he was going to do one last thing. He was going to create a research book that would give a good idea for fishermen what these fish they were catching really looked like, because until that time, most of them were just still almost black and white drawings that weren't very interesting. He did over 100 drawings that were published in a book called An Artist's Catch that his son published after Frank passed away. And Frank lived to 1966, and here he is with one of his very favorite paintings. We've got several different versions of this painting, these ducks. Sometimes there's 5, sometimes there's 7, sometimes they're in the water, sometimes it's fall, sometimes it's winter. But he kept returning to his ducks and his dogs over and over again. Frank was an amazing man. He lived an amazing life, and he left behind an amazing legacy. And I hope that you have enjoyed hearing more about it. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions, comments? Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. If you go online to NC Archives, search doc. We're very original. We call our search engine doc for documents. And then you put in your search engine. The only thing you want to be sure is which one of the 3 ones you want to search, because we have things, each area has materials.
I'm going to ask.
Have some bookmarks back there. Please help yourself to bookmarks in our conversion.
Questions?
Hannah now runs her own business doing research and historical tours and ghost tours of the Outer Banks. So her part is back there as well. Any other questions? Yes.
I'd like to mention also that we have a very large Facebook page. We're on Facebook. I went into it once and never went back. My wife does it all the time. There's a Facebook about flat top cottages, and there are hundreds and hundreds of photographs in it. And lots of things are posted all the time. And out right at the front, there's a thing about the tour and also in the museum and how you can go online and buy a ticket, or you can buy tickets on site. But on site, they're cash with check. We're looking forward to seeing you.
Thank you all very much for coming out today. Thank you.
Thank you.